Today, the plant that most people are familiar with is an angiosperm, that is the flowering plants, but it wasn't always that way on Earth. Gymnosperms and maybe some early angiosperms were probably the dominant plant for a long time, and they were major sources of food for the early mammals and the dinosaurs, the herbivorous dinosaurs. And then an event happened that changed the course of Earth's history, and that was 65 million years ago. It's called the KT event. It's when a large meteorite crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The consequences of that meteorite, again, this is called the KT event a lot of times because it happened in between the Cretaceous period and the Tertiary period. And why the K? Don't ask me. People liked it better, I guess. So the comet led to huge amounts of ash, smoke, and haze that reduced the amount of sunlight that could get to plants. And so that killed off a lot of the world's plants. And this was for a long period of time, right? So it's not just ash for a day, it's ash for a really long period of time. That's why it would have killed off plants. And then anything that was really reliant on eating plants and was large, so especially the large energy intensive animals, died off. So dinosaurs went extinct because they were so energy intensive. They just couldn't get the resources that they needed. The only exception being the birds, which are their modern descendants. So that cleared the landscape of Earth. You lost a lot of plants, lost a lot of animals. And so when you get a void like that, it gets filled by new species as the Earth recovers. And what happened with plants was that the gymnosperms left behind a space for those angiosperms that there hadn't been that many of. And so the angiosperms diversified and filled into that void. And actually the same thing happened with animals. The reptiles had been the dominant species on Earth. And after the KT event, there was a void left by the extinction of the dinosaurs, and that void was filled by the mammals. And so today mammals are one of the dominant types of animals on Earth. So what is an angiosperm? It's a flowering seed plant. So flowers are structures that appear as the critical innovation. They're specialized and optimized for increased reproduction. So the seeds form inside of the flower and will be formed inside of a structure called a fruit. So also associated with flowers is fruits. They go together. So flowers, fruits go together, and so does this third trait here for double fertilization. So while we call them the flowering plants, it's actually this three-part combo. The fruits develop from flowers and enclose the seed. They help improve seed dispersal. And then double fertilization is when a second sperm will actually fertilize tissue inside of the flower, and that will lead to a nutritive tissue called the endosperm. And this nutritive seed tissue will give more energy storage to the new embryo, so helping increase reproductive success as well. So one of the key traits, again, is flowers. They first appeared about 140 million years ago. They are this critical innovation that enhances reproductive success. And there's a ton of diversification that happens around flowers. So if you think today about flowers that come to your mind, you might picture lilies or roses, dandelions, perhaps not as much recognizing it as a flower as a broccoli head. So broccoli is little tiny flowers all over the broccoli. They just haven't bloomed yet when you're eating it. Wheat, the top of wheat is a flower. If you've ever seen wheat growing, before it makes the seeds, there's little flowers. Corn is made from flowers. So again, we don't picture not everything that we think of when we think flower. We're not capturing everything, but it includes a wide array of plants. And that diversification of the flowers for different reproductive strategies. So we'll look at flower parts first, and then talk about how those flower parts are used, and then look at the life cycle. So there's 4 types of organs within a flower: sepals and petals. And so sepals are the little green things that are sometimes at the base of flowers, and petals, I think most people are familiar with petals, are the actually generally a pretty color part of the flower. Now, some flowers, the petals and sepals are identical, and so what you have are tepals instead. And so I have a picture here of a lily. A lily has tepals because you see there's no separate green pieces down here, and we'll see an example of sepals and petals in a second, but this is an example of tepals. We also have in the flower the stamen, which produce pollen. On the lily, that's these orange-headed things, and that's actually the pollen. If you've ever had a bouquet of lilies in your house, you have to be really careful with that because it drops pollen onto your tablecloth or your carpet. It's really staining, or it gets on your fingers. And then the pistil/carpels, that's the female part in the lily. It's this central part that you may or may not be able to see. You can kind of see it at this angle, this one here. It's in the center of the stamens. So here's a figure that shows those flower parts on a diagram. So again, we have the petal, and here's a sepal. So again, remember when they look different, when the sepal's green and the flowers or the petals are colored, they have a different name. Here's the stamen, which actually has like the little filament part and the anther at the top. The anther was the orange part on the lily. The anther is actually where the pollen is released. So sometimes this is also thought of as sort of the male parts. So the flower may have both. So it has male parts and female parts. And then the central part is the pistil, composed of one or more carpels, and it actually has three important parts we're going to talk about: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So the stigma is this top part. It's generally sticky because that's where the pollen is going to adhere to. The style is like a little tube-like structure that the sperm is going to have to travel down. And then the ovary is important because it encloses the ovules, and the ovules are where the eggs are going to be. So the ovary contains, and so in this case, the ovary contains multiple ovules. In some cases, it will only contain one ovule. Just depends on the type of flower and the way that the fruit is going to form. So there are names for flowers depending on whether they have all of the different parts. So complete or incomplete flowers depends on whether or not they have all four of those flower organs. So remember that sepals, petals, stamen, and pistils/carpels. And an incomplete flower lacks one or more of those. And then perfect flowers specifically refer to the male and female parts. So a perfect flower contains both the stamens and carpels, so it's containing both male and female parts. And an imperfect flower lacks either stamens or carpels. And so this is dependent on the organism, whether so it's not accidental, I guess is what I'm saying. They either make male and female parts on their flowers, or they only have one. So this flower is an example of a perfect flower. It contains both. So the lily was also an example of a perfect flower. It contains both. But zucchini flowers are always either male or female. And in fact, if you've ever eaten zucchini flowers, you're eating the male ones. So the male ones don't develop into fruit because they don't have ovules. And so you only need a couple of male flowers to pollinate your female flowers to get zucchinis. And so a lot of people will either pick or buy those male flowers and make them you can stuff them with cheese and stuff like that. Okay, so again, I mentioned that for the female parts, we're going to focus on these three parts: the stigma, the style, and ovary, because they're involved in the life cycle. So the stigma is the top part that receives and recognizes pollen. So it's responsible for making sure that only the right type of pollen can get down into the ovary. So a rose flower is not going to be able to be pollinated by a dandelion, right? Only rose pollen will pollinate rose flowers because of what the stigma does. If it's the right type of pollen, then the pollen will kind of wake up and germinate, and it will send down its pollen tube. And so it sends its pollen tube down the style. So just to refresh your memory here, we've got our stigma at the top where the pollen grain lands, and then the pollen will send a pollen tube down the style to the ovary where the ovules are. And so the ovary encloses and protects the ovules. And so the pollen tube is actually delivering sperm directly to the ovules. And it's there in the ovules that the fertilized egg will form. after fertilization. Remember, there's the second fertilization. So in angiosperms, we have the double fertilization. And so also within the ovule, we'll have endosperm produced next to the embryo. And then after that's sort of happened, the ovaries will develop into fruit. So the ovary wall actually thickens into fruit. And the seeds are inside of it or embedded into it. And so if you think about something like a peach, you have your peach fruit, and there's the big seed on the inside. So that was where the ovule was, and this is the thickened ovary. There was at one point a flower on here. The remnants of the flower have dried and broken off of the fruit by the time the fruit ripens. Oops. Okay, so let's take a look at the life cycle. Again, I just want to remind you that we still have our basic life cycle where haploid spores develop into gametophytes. Gametophytes mature gametes. So this is haploid, this is haploid. We get fertilization of an egg and a sperm. The fertilization leads to a zygote that develops into a sporophyte. And then the sporophyte will have parts that will go through meiosis, and that brings us back to spores. So that's always our, and I'll just add here diploid sporophyte. So we have a diploid zygote, diploid sporophyte. So meiosis produces spores. And again, this is so weird for us because this is different from animals, which is why I want to reiterate it. So the flowering life cycle adds in some extra structures, but it's still that same basic life cycle, but the sporophyte generation is very, very, very dominant now. So like we talked about the gymnosperms, the gametophyte is really just a tiny part of pollen and within the developing seed. So let's start here with the sporophyte. So this is our mature sporophyte. So this is our plant. This is when you're walking out in the street or out on a path or something, and you see plants, you're looking at the sporophyte. The gametophyte is teeny tiny microscopic. So the mature plant is always the sporophyte. It's diploid tissue. Okay. Within, excuse me, within parts of the flower, right, you have male parts and female parts. So if we look at the top here, first, we'll do the male parts first. This is the anther of the flower. So this is the top of the stamen. So within the anther, we have microsporangia. And the microsporangia are structures where meiosis will occur, right? There's that meiosis. And so when meiosis occurs, it produces the microspores. So the microspores will then mature into male gametophytes. So microspores are becoming male gametophytes. And so that's within the pollen grain. And within the pollen grain, some of those male gametophytes will mature into sperm as well. Okay, so we're getting haploid male gametophyte tissue and sperm inside of the pollen. Okay, so let's take a look at the female side. So now we're looking in the ovule. So this is down in the bottom of the flower. So if you think about, like, here's my really ugly rose, right? There's like the kind of bulbous part at the bottom of the rose. I'm mentioning rose because I feel like that's the kind of flower that most people kind of know a little bit. So we're down here in that thick part. That's where the ovule is. So the down in the ovule, we have the megasporangium. And what's going to happen with that megasporangium is some meiosis. Meiosis is going to produce a megaspore. And then the megaspore is going to, so there's our megaspore, then the megaspore is going to divide into female gametophyte tissue. And then some of those cells will become eggs. So there's an egg there. Okay, so we have our female gametophyte tissue with the egg inside of there. And we have some nuclei kind of floating around in here that are going to be important. So we'll just keep in mind that we have some nuclei here that are part of the gametophyte tissue, but not the egg. And so if the pollen grain, the correct pollen grain, finds the stigma, so this is the stigma sticking out of a flower, right? The pollen grain lands there. It sends down its pollen tube. So here's the pollen tube. And down that pollen tube into the style, the sperm are going to come. So the sperm swim down into the ovary where the ovules are. And so you get double fertilization. The egg is fertilized, and so is this tissue right here. So we have one fertilization, two fertilization. One fertilization leads to the diploid zygote, and the second fertilization leads to endosperm. Okay, so these little floating around nuclei will get the sperm added to them, and they'll become endosperm tissue. So the embryo begins to divide. So the zygote grows into an embryo inside of the ovule. There's the thickened endosperm around the embryo. And then as this matures, a seed coat will harden around it. And depending on what kind of plant it is, some kind of coating will occur around it that is its fruit. So I mentioned rose. Fruits don't always look like peaches. Like in some cases, it's like delicious and fleshy like a peach. Something like a rose is much more modest. It has like rose hips, which are like little berries you can sometimes see on roses in the winter time. So that's a different type of fruit. This is, in this picture here, it's a very reduced fruit. It's like a wheat berry is what they're sometimes called. So fruit is not always that super fleshy stuff we're familiar with, but that's the basic life cycle of an angiosperm.